Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Let's jump right in today.
We're looking at something that really makes you question, well, everyday reality.
hmm
Asking, what if what we see, what we touch, what if that isn't the whole story?
Right.
So today's deep dive is all about moving beyond maybe the illusion of a purely physical world, exploring if there's clarity to be found somewhere else.
And we're drawing on some fascinating source material here, particularly one that offers what it calls an ancient perspective on all
The
this.
ancient perspective, yeah.
It's suggesting a pretty fundamental shift in how we see things, not about like escaping the world, but understanding it differently.
Exactly. So our mission today is to, well, unpack these core ideas. We want to get into why our senses, amazing as they are, might also be major limitations.
hmm
And how does this connect to other frameworks? The source mentions Dr. DeMartini's work, for instance, pointing towards a kind of deeper order.
And importantly, what can you actually do? The source talks about these trials,
Mm.
practical steps to maybe start perceiving beyond just the physical stuff. Yeah, consider this your shortcut to grappling with this uh, potentially huge shift in perspective.
So the starting point, the basic premise in the source, it's this idea that reality is just, well, way bigger than our senses tell us. It
Right.
suggests that, civilizations, and maybe us included, we often act as if the material world, the physical stuff, is it, the
Yeah.
only reality.
Yeah, and there's that great analogy in the source, like we're fish in a vast ocean convinced that only the water they could see was real.
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It really is. Suggests we might be swimming in something much, much larger without even realizing it.
Exactly, because the source argues underneath it all, there's this boundless, energetic, and conscious universe.
Okay.
That's the bedrock, the sort of fundamental layer, often unseen, but it's what's really driving things, shaping the physical.
So if that's the foundation, what does that mean for our physical senses? The source calls them magnificent tools, which, yeah, they are for getting around,
Sure, absolutely essential.
but then immediately calls them magnificent filters.
Filters, yeah, that's the crucial word. They're amazing at helping us navigate, keeping us safe, letting us interact, but they only capture, like, a tiny fraction of what's actually out there.
Right.
The source points out, we only see a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, hear a narrow band of sound frequencies.
Think about Wi-Fi signals, radio waves.
Exactly, all passing through us right now, totally unnoticed by our built-in equipment. Our senses are tuned to a very specific, very narrow channel.
Which leads to this really interesting idea that what we call reality is mostly a consensual agreement.
Hmm.
It's what we've all sort of implicitly agreed is real, based only on the limited data streams our biological filters allow.
Yeah, it's the shared interpretation of that sliver of information, and the source is pretty clear. The universe is infinitely more vast, more subtle, and more interconnected than your five senses can ever convey.
Our filters give us a manageable reality, but a very, very edited one.
Precisely. A limited edition.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, connecting the dots. How does this ancient perspective link up with, say, the mention of Dr. DeMartini's work in the source?
Well, the source sees a strong parallel there. DeMartini's insights, especially about universal intelligence and the idea that everything is inherently balanced.
Right, the balanced nature of things.
That really resonates with this concept of a deeper, non-physical order. He talks about universal laws operating behind the scenes, whether we see them directly or not.
So applying one of his core ideas, like finding the equal and opposite benefits in a perceived negative,
Mm-hmm.
the source basically says that's tapping into this deeper non-physical structure.
Exactly. It frames it as more than just, positive thinking. It's about actually perceiving the unseen support, the hidden balance or perfection that must be there according to these universal laws, even if your senses are telling you something is just bad or wrong.
So you're looking beyond the surface sensory input to a kind of underlying principle.
You're perceiving a deeper layer of reality. Yeah.
Now, there's a really important clarification the source makes here. Transcending this illusion, it says, is not to deny your body or your material world.
Absolutely critical point. This isn't about rejecting the physical.
No escapism.
Not at all. Source clear, the physical world isn't flawed or something to get away from. It's understood more as a manifestation, an expression of that deeper, fundamental, energetic reality.
Like a shadow, maybe. The shadow's real in its own way, but it depends entirely on the object casting it.
That's a good analogy. The physical is real, but it's an effect, an outcome of something more primary.
And this flips the script on consciousness, too. The source says thought, consciousness, and energy are not merely products of the brain.
which is the standard view, right? Brain creates mind.
Yeah, but here it's saying there are fundamental forces that shape the physical.
It completely reverses the usual perspective. It puts consciousness, thought, energy as primary, as the causal forces, and that changes everything about how we see ourselves.
Our inner world, basically. Like emotions, not just chemical reactions.
The source calls them energetic signals, signals carrying information, perhaps about our alignment or resonance with that deeper reality.
And thoughts. Not just brain zaps, but creative vibrations.
Creative vibrations. That implies they have influence, they have the power to interact with and shape that underlying field.
And intuition, that gut feeling.
Not just a random hunch, but a direct connection to a vaster intelligence.
Wow. Okay.
So intuition becomes a legitimate form of perception, accessing information beyond those 5 physical sense filters.
So, okay, what's the benefit? What's the
Right.
payoff if you start to perceive things this way, beyond the purely physical?
Well, the source talks about achieving profound clarity. You literally start seeing the world, yourself, your experiences in a completely new way.
There's also,
You might start sensing the interconnectedness of all things, noticing those subtle energetic exchanges happening all the time.
and maybe recognizing that underlying perfection in seemingly chaotic events, seeing the balance DeMartini talks about, even when things look messy on the surface.
Exactly, seeing the hidden order. And this perception shift, it allows for a kind of healthy detachment.
How do you mean detachment?
Not being cold or uncaring, but detachment from the drama of the physical world. You can still be fully engaged, living, creating.
But you're anchored somewhere deeper.
Precisely. You know you're connected to a deeper reality that isn't constantly fluctuating like the physical world seems to.
So it changes your relationship with your physical experiences. The source says they become merely reflections of your inner state.
Which is a massive claim, and it leads to perhaps the most empowering part. By mastering your inner world, you gain profound influence over your outer reality.
Because if the outer is just a reflection,
Change the inner landscape, and the reflection has to change too. That's the idea.
that's what the source calls the ultimate liberation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Realizing you are not just a body, but a magnificent conscious being having a physical experience.
That's the core realization. And it's not just left as a nice idea. The source provides these practical exercises, these dragon trials, to actually help train this kind of perception.
Okay, let's get practical then.
Yeah.
What are these trials? The first one involves sensing an energetic field.
Right. The instruction is, pick someone you know well. Close your eyes, picture them, but then shift your focus away from their visual image. Try to sense their presence, their energy, their vibe.
So not what they look like, but what they feel like.
Exactly. Pay attention to any subtle feelings, sensations, maybe a warmth, a coolness, a sense of peace, a buzzing, anything that feels like information about them that isn't coming through your usual physical senses right then. You're tuning into a different channel.
Interesting. A different way to connect. What's the second practice?
This one's called intuitive knowing. It's for small, everyday decisions. The idea is to pause your logical brain for a moment.
Okay.
Ask your intuition for guidance on that small decision. Then, notice the very first thought, feeling, image, or impulse that comes up before you start analyzing it or doubting it.
That first hit.
Yeah, that very first subtle signal. The instruction is to then go with that intuitive nudge for that small thing. And afterwards, just notice and compare how it felt or worked out compared to what your logical mind might have chosen. It's about learning to recognize that intuitive voice.
Kind of like tuning a radio to a faint station, learning its signal. And the third trial.
This one's called Beyond the Senses. It's about actively stretching your awareness at the edges of your normal perception.
How do you do that?
Sit quietly, maybe close your eyes. Try to focus on sounds at the absolute edge of your hearing, the really faint stuff you usually ignore. Or open your eyes slightly and notice details at the very edge of your sight, in your peripheral vision.
Okay.
The source also suggests trying to sense the space between objects. What does that feel like? Or listen for the silence between sounds. Can you perceive the absence, the stillness?
It's like trying to perceive the canvas instead of just the paint.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
You're training your awareness to notice what's not the obvious physical form or sensation, tuning into the background.
Okay, so the whole point of these exercises.
According to the source, it's to deliberately train your ability to perceive these subtle, energetic, and intuitive dimensions of reality, to help you start seeing through that illusion of a purely physical world.
Right, so let's wrap this up. We've explored this idea from our sources that, well, our everyday reality might be just the tip of the iceberg, limited by our senses.
and that there's potentially a much vaster, non-physical dimension, energetic, conscious, underlying everything.
And understanding this, or even just considering it, really changes how we might view ourselves and the world around us.
And crucially, it's not about denying the physical, right? It's about seeing it as an expression of something deeper.
Exactly. And we touched on those practical steps, the dragon trials, that the source suggests for actually starting to cultivate this wider perception.
Sensing energy, tuning into intuition, perceiving beyond the obvious senses.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. If, and it's a big if presented by these sources, but if your physical experiences really are reflections of your inner state, what kind of potential, what kind of influence might open up if you genuinely started to cultivate and maybe master that inner world?
And thinking about those practical steps, we discussed sensing, intuiting, expanding awareness. What's one small experiment you could try, maybe even today, just to practice perceiving a little bit beyond the obvious, solid physical forms in your own life?